Imagine a mansion so vast it redefines the coastline, a place whose facades became shorthand for wealth in newspapers and postcards. Imagine marble steps that run like a river of white down to a garden so manicured that the horizon looks like a painting. They called it the grandest Vanderbilt house on the eastern shore. But behind the carved stone, behind the walnut banisters and the chandeliers, there was another ledger of small entries that add up to a different cost, a cost measured not in columns but in nights without sleep, in names that fall out of ledgers, in illnesses that never made the society pages. The story people see on tours is a polished narrative of triumph and taste. The story that sits in boxes under the eaves is full of erasures, curfews, and choices that rippled beyond the family. Lydia Archer was 34, an independent researcher who made films about architecture and labor, and she thought she knew what a Gilded Age house would tell her. On her first late afternoon visit, when the house felt like a mouth half closed by evening, she felt something else, a silence that was not absence, but omission. The service door was unlocked, as if someone had forgotten to close a chapter. The air that drifted out smelled of boiled potatoes, old soap, and a faint metallic tang that no tour mentions. She decided to pry. What she found would redraw the lines between glamour and cost. In the next hour, we will walk past the drawing rooms and into attics of paper, follow signatures that betray promises never kept, and track how a dynasty's ascent carried in its shadow a series of tragedies and deaths. If you like investigations that stop at no detail, subscribe and tell us in the comments which house you want us to explore next. Now come through the gate and listen to what the walls will finally say. Night had a way of amplifying the mansion. The stone turned a darker gray, the gardens melted into a velvet seam, and inside, the portraits seemed to breathe out history. Lydia stepped through the threshold while the last light slid like glass across the hallway. The floor under her shoes gave a faint hollow note from a repair done in some earlier winter. The air smelled of lemon polish and beeswax, but beneath that was the old smell of coal and stew, a scent of many hands at work. She moved through the main salon while the staff had already gone home and the seasonal guides had packed their script into their pockets. The chandelier made a mosaic on the rug. A small hinge near the servants' corridor was loose, and behind it, Lydia found a scuffed wooden step, a narrow stair hardly advertised on any plan. She felt the stair lead down into a flank of the house that tours never mentioned, a subcellar of accounts and the remains of a coal bunker. From below came the sound of pipes settling. The hush was full of history. Lydia found a ledger wedged beneath a beam, its pages swollen with damp. She read an entry that made her pause, a note about a payment withheld after a fire. She looked up just then, and a patrolman in a navy jacket startled her in the dim. "You should not be down here after hours," he said. "Tours are closed." Lydia replied that she was part of a film crew, show license in hand. The man squinted, reached for his radio, then softened when he caught her badge. "We get curious folks after dark," he said. "Most of them leave when the security lights click on." Lydia smiled and asked, "Have you ever heard of the 1898 fire?" He frowned. "There was a small blaze, yeah. Family said it was contained. Why?" "The ledger mentions repairs that don't match the official report," Lydia said. He shrugged. "Official reports are neat things. The house has always liked neat reports." They exchanged a look. He walked her back up, and the corridor seemed to adjust, as if the mansion had read her will and decided whether she should remain in the margins or be let into the center. That stair, that ledger, that short exchange were the first small fractures she would follow. Back in daylight, Lydia sat across a long oak table in a municipal archive, where sunlight came through a high window and pooled on stacks of boxes. She unwrapped a brittle ribbon and pulled out blueprints and photographs, letters folded with a care that felt like liturgy. The paper had the scent of glue and old ink. The archivist, a woman named Lydia had already spoken with briefly at the mansion, introduced herself again as Lydia was handed another Lydia, in town often mistaken for coincidence.
The archivist was named Lydia Hart, and she smiled with the practiced warmth of someone who spends her life coaxing out the past from cardboard. "You're the one from the film," she said. "We keep a lot of ledgers that never saw daylight." Lydia looked up. "There's a repair ledger that mentions a fire, and the numbers don't add up to the insurance claims." Lydia Hart nodded and reached for a folio of correspondence. "We have the contractor letters, the receipts, a surgeon's note, and a woman named Margot's diary who worked in the scullery. They'll ruffle the official story." They began to cross-reference. A map of the house, a plan with service corridors, a list of staff for the summer season of 1898, and an insurance form with a stamped approval dated 2 days after the blaze. "This signature," Lydia said, pointing to a cramped script, "James Vanderbilt's. He approved the claim." Lydia Hart tapped a pencil. "Paper likes to be read sideways sometimes. There's a marginal note criticizing how the claim was calculated." Lydia read aloud a line, "Reduce by half if restoration uses family labor." The archivist laughed softly. "Family labor?" Then Lydia asked, "Do we have anything from the workers themselves?" The archivist's face changed. "We have letters tucked into a cookbook, a nurse's note with the surgeon's seal, and several wage ledgers." She slid a thin packet across the table. Lydia opened it and found not only sums, but scrawled names: Ruth, Samuel, Thomas, Eleanor, and a terse line about unpaid overtime. Lydia felt the files breathe like a living thing. "There is a process to request copies," Lydia Hart said, "but for film, you can get access with a letter from the archive director." They exchanged the usual clerical pleasantries. The room hummed with the small sounds of an archive: paper shuffling, a cart's wheel, the distant buzz of traffic like an undercurrent. Lydia left with photocopies, a promise of more boxes to be unwrapped, and the sense that if the mansion had a public face, the archives kept the private ledger of choices. The construction story began with an ambitious plan and an argument about stone. The original owner, whom newspapers named James Winslow Vanderbilt, wanted a house to outshine, to place on a headland where cliffs met the sea. Contracts survive in which he argued for imported stone and an elaborate heating system intended to make the house habitable year-round. The blueprints show an arc of rooms built for display. The music room with a ceiling almost absurdly painted by artists shipped from Europe, a dining hall with panels of walnut carved by machine and by hand, and a servant corridor that loops like a spine. But the house's earliest months are marked by an event every local remembers in gossip, if not in official minutes: a fire that began in a back kitchen, fed by coal dust and a failing stovepipe. The surgeon's report, preserved in a hospital ledger, describes burns and inhalation injuries. A contractor's letter details which columns needed replacement and which moldings could be patched. The insurance company paid out a sum listed in the ledger, and in the margins a clerk drew a small star beside a deduction: family discount for in-kind labor. The backstory of James is essential. He was a son of a shipping fortune who turned toward railroads and steel. He inherited not only shares, but expectations, both financial and social. He believed architecture was a language of power. Yet in private letters, he confided fatigue and a reoccurring cough that worsened after the fire. His wife, Eleanor, was younger, a patron of music, and a woman who recorded evenings in a private planner now yellowed. She wrote about parties, about hosting painters, and about feeling the weight of their house as a thing that required constant tending. The reconstruction that followed the blaze cost more than the family acknowledged publicly. Contracts, ledgers, and a contractor's docket annotate nights of overtime paid in ale and promises rather than wages. A reconstruction plan filed at the county shows substitutions: cheaper nails, beams cut from a closer yard, and the addition of a wing that doubled as a servant's dormitory. A process description in the archive explains how beams are tested for char and replaced when compromised. Conservators note thermal stress lines, perform boroscopies, and replace sections with matched grain timbers when possible, a procedure that costs thousands and requires artisans familiar with period joinery.
That technical note reads precise and clinical, but it outlines choices that, when combined with the wage ledger, stitch together a pattern of who gained and who paid. The servant's world was the backbone of the estate, and it exists in memes that the family seldom put in print but that the ledger kept in neat rows. There was Ruth McKinley, head housekeeper, who managed a staff roster and wrote terse notes in a small bound book. Her handwriting preserved shifts and complaints. 2 waitresses out sick, a new boy who broke a pane. Samuel Reed was the butler, formal and exact, who recorded deliveries and often accompanied accounts to the bank. Thomas Blake tended the gardens and kept a small register of plants, noting when imported roses failed the coastal wind. Eleanor Sims, not to be confused with Lady Vanderbilt, was the nursery maid who wrote letters to her sister about the children's illnesses and about a winter of coughs. Margot Alvarez worked in the scullery and kept a diary in which she stitched together recipes, dates of overtime, and an entry about seeing smoke rise one morning like a bad omen. Lydia, as she read these documents aloud in a volunteer's cramped kitchen at the archive, felt the voices come forward. "We had to cover the burn marks with curtains because the master did not like the sight of char," Margot had written in a line full of economy. Another page records a wage increase that was later clawed back by a management error. Dialogue surfaces in fragments. Ruth to Samuel, "The plates are not shining." Samuel to Ruth, "We will make them shine before the party." Thomas murmurs to Ruth about the frost. "Plant the bulbs lower, it will keep." Margot to a friend, "They count the hours as if we were nails." Each line, when pieced together, creates a portrait of a staff household that kept the social life of the mansion running. The ledger lists 36 staff that first summer, and then 27 the following year. Salaries were low, tips were sporadic. The staff often took on extra tasks for room and board. A 1902 wage summary shows average pay for a domestic attendant and the household's net outlay listed as a single line among many expenses. Lydia felt the house as a machine that required constant hands, hands that were seldom named in the picture frames. Illness crept through the household like a slow tide. The surgeon's notes and a nurse's ledger record feverish nights and bronchial complications, continuing through 2 successive winters. James's cough became a recurring motif in letters. He wrote about nights of sweat and the heaviness at the base of his chest. Eleanor's personal planner shows entries where she cancels salons and then apologizes in letters for the cancellations, attributing them to family ailments. The staff letters record insomnia, malnutrition, and long shifts that preceded fainting spells. A list of funerals kept by the town's church includes names with service addresses at the mansion and causes listed in clinical terms: pneumonia, complications following influenza, and one ambiguous sudden fall in a service stair. Publicly, the family's statements minimize the losses as private grief. Privately, the house's expenses ballooned on account of medical care. A ledger entry notes payments to Dr. Henry Caldwell for home visits and an invoice for a specialist called from the city. Medical records show that a young footman named Edward developed persistent bronchitis and was discharged with a small gratuity. Stories from descendants describe sleepless nights while charcoal fires were banked to stave off damp. These threads, when woven together, show that the mansion's sheen demanded bodies in steady motion, and that when those bodies failed, the household patched the narrative with silence and payments. War and shifting economics pressed on the family's margins. By the first decades of the 20th century, sons and nephews signed enlistment papers. Workers left for the docks and the war industry. The ledgers show sudden gaps, positions left vacant, salaries reallocated to war bonds. Tax records illustrate a different pressure. Assessments rose with property values, and municipal demands for maintenance of seawalls and drainage increased costs. The house needed draining pipes replaced after a storm season and a new seawall to correct erosion that threatened the foundations. An engineer's report details scour patterns at the base of the cliff and recommends heavy boulder placements and pilings, a work that required laborers, material shipments, and engineering oversight. The invoice is generous and precise. The notation in the margin says, "Approved under protest."
The village council records reflect debates. Should a private estate receive municipal aid to protect a coastline used by citizens? The answer was often a quiet arrangement of subsidies and charitable dinners that rendered civic policy porous. A set of workers' letters shows that several staff members enlisted and did not return. Ruth's scrawled note in her ledger reads, "Tom left for the sea. If he should not return, who will hoist the blinds?" The family pumped money into war relief and dinners, and yet their own operational costs crept upward. Financial ledgers mark the purchase of war bonds and donations, and an accountant named Jonas Pratt appears in the papers as someone who reallocated funds to cover both philanthropic pledges and maintenance gaps. The house that once symbolized unshakable privilege found itself negotiating with taxes, tides, and the disappearance of the labor that had always been there. The transition from private home to public site is rarely clean. Decades later, as the family line thinned and taxes remained unforgiving, negotiations began in earnest about opening the house to
the public or selling off parcels to developers. There were meetings at the town hall, letters exchanged between a conservator named Dr. Avery Hale and the family's council, and a tense auction in which some decorative objects were consigned. The transfer was a negotiation about meaning as much as money. A letter from Mayor Collins to the Vanderbilt trustee archives the city's desire for public access. "We ask only that the estate remain a site of education." The trustees responded with conditions about donor plaques and preservation of certain rooms. Community reactions included praise from preservationists, skepticism from those who viewed the estate as a symbol of inequality, and petitions from descendants of the staff seeking historical recognition. In a heated public hearing, a descendant named Margot's great-granddaughter spoke and said, "My grandmother washed the silver so they could eat from cups with her hands' marks on them, and we have never had a plaque." Present in the audience was Jonah Peters, a former gardener who now paired for a community plot. He argued for an exhibit that honors the staff. Negotiations revolved around funding for conservation, decision rights, and the creation of an interpretive center. A conservator's estimate came in, and it was sobering. Millions for structural stabilization, additional hundreds of thousands for conservation of painted ceilings, and ongoing annual budgets for maintenance. The paperwork included an architectural assessment that specified repointing masonry, replacing corroded ironwork, and climate control installation to protect textiles. The technical note on climate control describes a process of installing HVAC with minimal visual impact using hidden ducts and installing microclimates within display cases to prevent further deterioration. The cost line was a headline. The city did not have the funds. A private trust did not want public strings. Ultimately, the solution was a hybrid one, a public partnership that allowed the house to open seasonally, restricted rooms on rotation, and a new welcome center that housed a small archive accessible by appointment. The welcome center itself became a battleground of priorities. Should the center prioritize art or labor histories? A small committee convened and 5 members, including Lydia and Jonah, drafted a proposal to create an oral history fund in honor of the household staff. The negotiation revealed the complex choreography required to make a private site public without simply polishing it for strangers. The deeper tensions in the mansion emerged in moments that felt like collapses. One such moment was the discovery of an unmarked grave on a steep slope near a service entrance, a grave found when the grounds crew exposed a stone while working a drainage trench. The team called Jonah, who remembered, then called Lydia. The grave yielded a small, partially decayed wooden marker with initials that matched a name in the ledger. For 2 days, the town argued about whether to delay tours. The exhumation required permits, a forensic team, and a sensitive public statement. The process took weeks. A forensic report summarized osteological details and inferred age and possible cause of death, a document that read clinical and devastating at once. The second moment of tension was a scandal when a descendant produced a cache of letters claiming the family's patriarch had coerced staff into signing documents that waived entitlements in exchange for lodgings. The letters were ambiguous, sometimes written in hurried script, often unsigned. Public reaction was immediate. The third moment involved a crack that appeared in a painted ceiling during a storm season. A heavy rain worsened a hairline fracture, and paint flaked like dried leaves.
The conservator, Dr. Avery, convened a team to perform emergency consolidation using adhesives and to erect supports. The fourth tense episode revolved around the budget debate. The trustees proposed a fee increase for visitors that provoked community protest. The fifth moment occurred when a donor threatened to withdraw funding unless certain portraits were returned to a private collection. Each of these episodes unfolded with documents, letters, petitions, and meetings. They required mediation, publicity plans, and ethically fraught choices. The exhumation took a week of forensic sampling, with careful chain of custody recorded. The letters required handwriting verification. The ceiling needed specialized consolidants to prevent paint loss without altering the original brushwork. Each intervention was small in description and enormous in consequence. The debates about conservation were both technical and moral. When conservators assessed the painted ceiling after the crack appeared, their reports spoke in exact terms. Microsuction tests, consolidation using methyl cellulose and a reversible adhesive, and humidity control installed at a tolerance of plus or minus 3%. The work took 3 conservators, scaffolding, and a 2-week closure of the room. That particular technical process is typical of conservation work, documenting the object, testing materials in situ, applying reversible treatments, and monitoring long-term. When accounts were audited, the accounting process was similarly methodical. Ledgers reconciled line by line, auditors cross-matched vendor invoices with contracts, and an account called house upkeep was reclassified into preventive conservation and reactive repair. The auditor's note stated that preventive spending reduces cumulative costs over time but requires upfront investment. A restoration project's line item reads as a short narrative: replace guttering, repoint south wall, install discrete lightning protection. Each of those items, when detailed, translates into skilled labor and ongoing lifetime commitments. These technical descriptions are dry, but reveal choices. To cut maintenance is to accept decline. To spend is to prioritize authenticity and memory. By the time public access began in earnest, the house had become a palimpsest of histories. Visitors streamed through on summer days, their cameras catching the big rooms and the curated tableau. At 1 month after the opening, visitation rose beyond initial estimates. School groups booked tours, and the Welcome Center filled with local families. The staff curated a small display that acknowledged the household employees, featuring copies of Ruth's ledger, Margot's diary, and a photograph of Samuel in his formal uniform. 1 month on, a small grant was awarded to digitize the staff records to create broader access, and the archive reported an uptick in scholarly inquiries from graduate students. 3 months after opening, the town saw a subtle shift. Local restaurants noted an increase in dinner reservations, and a community group requested a dedicated evening program exploring the lives of domestic staff. The Society of Preservation recorded spikes in donations targeted to labor history. A program was initiated to collect oral histories from descendants. Several families contributed tapes and photographs. At that 3-month mark, a small stipend was announced for the creation of an oral history fellowship. The fellowship funded young researchers to interview descendants and produce materials for the museum. 6 months later, the partnership produced a modest but meaningful change. The museum launched a rotating gallery entitled Behind the Curtains, focusing exclusively on the service staff. Attendance for the specialized tours was strong, and the archive released a searchable index of names. The municipal council voted to allocate a small portion of lodging taxes to a maintenance endowment. These were measurable consequences, but they did not erase the harder questions. The exhibition led to uncomfortable conversations about how the public interprets wealth, service, and the ethics of preservation. For some, saving the mansion was a triumph of culture. For others, it was a spectacle that risked aestheticizing inequality. The epilogue stretches like 3 snapshots in time, each a consequence and a choice. 1 month after the formal opening, the mansion hummed with young voices. School tours arrived with worksheets. Docents adjusted scripts to include staff stories. An archaeology intern uncovered a small shard of ceramic behind a scholarly wall, suggesting a pattern of hurried repairs. The archive published a brief note announcing digitization of ledgers, which brought immediate requests from genealogists. Grants were small but steady. The daily life of the house felt alive, not only as a building, but as a living site where children pressed their palms to rope barriers and asked about the people who had not been framed in portraits. 3 months later, the conversation had deepened. The Oral History Fellowship was in full swing. Interviews populated an online resource. A controversy flared when a donor refused to fund programming that would prioritize staff narratives over portraits of the family. The trustees responded by creating a donor advisory panel that included descendants of former employees. The community chapters organized panels and a small symposium about labor and grandeur. Local media ran features that combined architecture and social history, and a small exhibition toured regional libraries. 6 months later, the project showed tangible institutional change. The Welcome Center launched an internship program for students from nearby colleges. The Maintenance Endowment gained a committed patron, and the museum adopted a policy to consult staff descendants about new exhibits. A modest scholarship was established to support research into domestic service history. Yet even with these gains, questions persisted. Would the mansion remain a monument to a single family's taste, or would it become a site that resituated that taste within the hands
that made it possible? The epilogue's 3 stages show incremental progress and the slow mechanics of public memory. In the end, the mansion stands as both artifact and argument. It is a spectacle of cedar and marble and a container of losses that seldom make the picture frames. We have followed ledgers and letters, accounts and conservation reports, and we have listened to voices that had been relegated to footnotes. The numbers are stark. Tens of thousands spent on restoration, dozens of staff named in the early ledgers, and hundreds of hours of conserved material. Yet the moral conclusion resists a tidy verdict. Preserving the house kept a material past alive, while forcing a public to reckon with the costs associated with that life. The work done in archives and on scaffolding matters because it decides which stories get to stand next to a portrait and which remain in the margins. If you found this investigation revealing, consider subscribing. This channel brings together careful research, document-led narrative, and on-the-ground conservation reporting. Share your stories if your family ever worked in a mansion like this. Often our best leads begin with a comment or a photograph tucked away in an attic. The mansion's stones will endure, but the human traces they contain demand attention. What we choose to preserve reflects not only taste, but a choice about whose hands matter in the history we hand to the future.